A few years ago, I was working late at a packaging factory, a place where the hum of machines and the aroma of cardboard boxes were my daily companions. It was a tough job, but it paid the bills. On this particular night, the rain was falling heavily outside, and I couldn't wait to get home. Little did I know that the walk home would become a nightmarish experience. As I stepped out of the factory, the rain pelted down, drenching me within seconds. I pulled my coat tighter and quickened my pace, determined to reach the sanctuary of my apartment. The city streets were empty, and the sound of the rain created a surreal, muffled atmosphere. I walked along dimly lit streets, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. That's when I began to feel it, the sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and continued my walk, my heart pounding with each step. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing louder in the empty streets. The rain was relentless, and my mind raced with fear. I tried to convince myself that it was just paranoia, that I was alone on the desolate streets. But then, I heard footsteps, not my own. They were slow and deliberate, echoing in the rain-soaked silence. I turned around and saw a man, a stranger, walking a few paces behind me. He was tall, dressed in a tattered coat, his face obscured by the hood. Panic surged through me, and I knew I was being followed. I picked up my pace, my heart thundering, but the man matched my speed. The rain soaked through my clothes, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I glanced around, desperate for help, but the streets remained empty. Fear consumed me as I realized I was alone with this man. The man's presence was menacing, and he made no attempt to hide the fact that he was following me. He seemed to be studying me, his eyes hidden beneath the hood. I could feel his gaze, and it sent shivers down my spine. I knew I had to find help or escape this situation. I spotted a nearby convenience store and made a split-second decision. I dashed inside, my heart pounding. The cashier, an older woman, looked at me with surprise. I quickly explained the situation, and she nodded, understanding the urgency. The man followed me into the store, his footsteps echoing ominously. I could feel his presence drawing closer, and my fear intensified. I begged the cashier to call the police, and she did so without hesitation. As I waited, the man continued to hover nearby, his eyes never leaving me. The minutes stretched on like hours, and the rain outside showed no sign of abating. My heart raced as I prayed for the police to arrive in time. When the sirens finally wailed in the distance, the man seemed to sense the impending danger. With one last, chilling glance, he turned and fled into the rainy night. The police arrived moments later, but the man had vanished into the darkness. I recounted the harrowing encounter to the officers, my voice trembling with fear. They assured me that they would do their best to locate the man, but I couldn't help but feel the trauma of that night. The relentless rain, the empty streets, and the menacing stranger had left an indelible mark on me. I returned to my apartment, drenched and shaken, and couldn't sleep that night. The nightmare of that encounter continued to haunt my dreams, a reminder of the very real terrors that exist in the world. I never knew what the man's intentions were, and I hoped that he would never cross my path again. Several years ago, my wife and I were enjoying a quiet evening at home. The night was stormy, rain drumming on our windows and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating our living room. We had just settled in to watch a movie when a knock at the door shattered the peaceful ambience. Startled, we exchanged curious glances. Who could be out in this tempestuous weather? As I made my way to the door, my wife followed closely behind. I opened it to find a man standing on our doorstep, rain-soaked and shivering. His car had apparently broken down, he explained, and he was from out of town. He desperately needed to use a phone to call for help. His appearance was disheveled, and he had an air of vulnerability that tugged at our compassion. The stormy night seemed like a perilous backdrop for anyone stranded in the dark. My wife, always a kind and empathetic soul, immediately invited him in. She offered him a towel to dry off and the use of our phone. I couldn't help but feel uneasy about the situation, but I trusted my wife's judgment. The man entered, offering his profuse thanks. He was tall, with piercing eyes that seemed to hide a multitude of secrets. We led him to the phone in our living room and offered him privacy to make his call. As my wife and I waited in the adjoining room, an eerie silence hung in the air. The storm outside intensified, the rain pelting against the windows like a symphony of dread. Minutes turned into a quarter of an hour, and the unease in the room deepened. I decided to check our unexpected guest, and as I entered the living room, I noticed the man was no longer on the phone. Instead, he was standing by our bookshelf, his fingers lightly tracing the spines of our books. I asked if he had managed to reach someone for help, but he simply smiled and claimed the line was busy. The smile didn't reach his eyes, and something about his demeanor sent a shiver down my spine. It was as though he had overstayed his welcome, his presence becoming invasive. As the storm raged on outside, I suggested that he continue trying to reach someone, offering to find another phone for him. But he insisted on staying in the living room. It was then that my wife and I exchanged concerned glances, realizing that something was amiss. Our polite facade began to crumble as the minutes dragged on, and the man showed no intention of leaving. We tried to engage him in conversation, hoping to uncover more about his background, but his answers were vague and evasive. The man's unsettling presence, combined with the relentless rain and darkness outside, created a feeling of entrapment in our own home. I knew we had to act to find a way to remove this stranger from our lives. I offered him the use of our cell phone, feigning a low battery on our landline. The man seemed reluctant but eventually agreed, taking the phone and stepping into another room to make his call. As soon as he was out of earshot, my wife and I seized the opportunity to call the police. We explained the situation, the discomfort and suspicion that had taken root in our home. As we waited for the authorities to arrive, my heart pounded with anxiety. What had the man's true intentions been? Had we narrowly escaped a dangerous encounter? When the police arrived, they questioned the man, who had become increasingly agitated. It was clear that his story had been a ruse, and his real purpose for entering our home remained a mystery. The authorities escorted him from our home, and as the door closed behind him, we finally let out the breath we'd been holding. The storm outside had ceased, and the tranquility of our home was restored. The encounter had left us shaken, and the realization that we had invited a potential threat into our lives was a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk in even the most ordinary of circumstances. The stormy night had turned our home into a nightmare, and the memory of that evening would forever haunt our thoughts. A few years ago, I found myself on a somber, rain-soaked journey to my family's old home up north. The news of my father's passing had arrived like a thunderbolt, shattering my world. It was a rainy night when I set out, the windshield wipers struggling to keep the downpour at bay. The highway stretched out before me, a solitary ribbon of concrete amid the dark and stormy night. As I drove through the relentless rain, my thoughts were a turbulent sea of memories and grief. My relationship with my father had been strained, marked by years of silence and unresolved conflicts. Now, with his passing, I found myself grappling with a tumult of emotions. Hours passed, and the rain showed no sign of letting up. I knew I had to stop for gas, the fuel gauge edging dangerously close to empty. I spotted a gas station on the side of the road, its neon sign flickering in the distance. The station seemed to materialize like an oasis in the night, offering a temporary respite from the relentless storm. I pulled into the station, the rain pouring down in torrents. The gas station was eerily quiet, with only the occasional burst of thunder in the distance. As I approached the pump, I noticed a solitary figure standing by one of the fuel dispensers, seemingly untouched by the rain. The man was tall, his face hidden beneath a hood, and he stood motionless, his back turned to me. I couldn't help but feel a shiver of unease. The gas station was deserted, and this lone figure seemed out of place in the desolation of the stormy night. I hesitated for a moment, contemplating whether to fill up the tank or leave and find another station. The man's stillness sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But my dwindling fuel supply left me with no choice but to continue. I picked up the fuel nozzle and began to pump gas into my car, my eyes never leaving the mysterious figure. It was as though he existed outside the realm of the storm, untouched by the deluge that surrounded him. As I finished fueling up, the man finally turned to face me. His eyes, shadowed by the hood, locked onto mine. I felt a cold dread settle over me as I realized he was staring at me with an intense, unwavering gaze. Without a word, he began to approach me, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The rain seemed to intensify, drowning out all other sounds. I fumbled for my car keys, my heart pounding in my chest. The sense of unease that had nagged at me earlier was now a full-blown terror. I jumped into my car and slammed the door shut, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the gas station, glancing in my rearview mirror to see the man watching me as I fled. My heart raced as I sped away from the gas station, the rain-slicked highway unfurling before me. The encounter with the mysterious man had left me shaken, and the darkness of the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. I finally reached my family's old home up north, but the memories of that chilling encounter lingered, casting a shadow over the sorrow of my father's passing. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man at the gas station had harbored intentions unknown, and the stormy night had become a nightmare etched into my memory. The rain, relentless as ever, continued to fall, a somber backdrop to the unresolved emotions and the chilling encounter that had marked my journey home. A few years back, I was working as a recovery driver, a job that often took me into the darkest hours of the night. One rainy night, my phone buzzed with an urgent call. A vehicle had broken down on the outskirts of town, and I was dispatched to assist. As I drove through the downpour, my mind raced with thoughts of what could have gone wrong. Little did I know, this would be a night I would never forget. Arriving at the scene, I found a group of 5 men huddled around the disabled vehicle. Their behavior was strange, to say the least. They looked jittery, their eyes darting around as though they were on the brink of a secret. I couldn't help but sense something was amiss. The vehicle had a flat tire, a mundane issue that shouldn't have warranted such unease. I decided to get to work, determined to change the tire and get these men back on the road. As I knelt down, the rain pouring down on me, the men remained oddly silent, observing my every move with intensity. I pulled the spare tire from the trunk and began to assess the situation. But as I opened the trunk, I was met with a sight that sent a bolt of terror down my spine. There, before me, lay a lifeless body, wrapped in a tarp. The men had a corpse in their trunk. Shock and fear consumed me as I stumbled back, my heart racing. The men maintained their eerie silence, their expressions devoid of emotion. I knew I had to act quickly, that my life was in danger. I pretended to have not seen the body, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. I continued to work on the tire, my hands trembling. The rain continued to fall, a symphony of dread that seemed to mock my predicament. My mind raced with questions. Who was the deceased person in the trunk? Why were these men traveling with a body? And what were their intentions? With the new tire in place, I finished the job and informed the men they were ready to go. Their silence remained unbroken, but the weight of their secret bore down on me like a suffocating fog. As they departed into the rainy night, I was left alone with my thoughts and the chilling memory of what I had discovered. I couldn't help but wonder what sinister events had led to this night. The rain washed away any evidence of their presence, but the nightmare was etched into my memory. I reported the incident to the authorities, who launched an investigation into the mysterious travelers. The truth behind the body in the trunk would eventually come to light, but the horror of that night would forever haunt my dreams. The rain that had fallen relentlessly that night served as a symbol of the darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary of situations. My job as a recovery driver had taken me to the edge of a real-life nightmare, and the memory of that chilling encounter would stay with me for the rest of my days. A few years ago, on a rainy evening, I found myself at home, seeking solace in the warm embrace of Netflix. The rain outside tapped a melancholic tune on my windows, and the coziness of my living room offered the perfect sanctuary from the dreary weather. As I delved into a movie marathon, I decided to order a pizza. It was the ultimate comfort food, the cheesy, warm indulgence that could turn any rainy day into a treat. The phone call was brief, and the person on the other end was friendly enough. They told me the pizza would arrive within 30 minutes, and I eagerly awaited its cheesy goodness. When the doorbell finally rang, I was ready. My stomach grumbled in anticipation, and I hurried to the door. I opened it to find a delivery driver, standing in the dim glow of my porch light. He was shrouded in darkness, the hood of his jacket pulled low over his face. I exchanged a polite greeting and reached for the pizza, eager to indulge. But as I looked up at the driver, a sense of unease washed over me. His eyes were obscured by shadows, making it impossible to gauge his expression. The man's demeanor was off-putting. He seemed in no hurry to leave, his gaze lingering on me, and a chilling silence hung in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I handed him the payment, hoping that this would expedite his departure. But instead, he reached for the money with a slow, deliberate movement, never taking his eyes off me. The seconds stretched on, and I could feel the tension in the room escalating. As he finally accepted the money, he muttered something unintelligible, his voice low and grating. I nodded and mumbled a thank you, hoping to bring a swift end to the encounter. The unease that had settled in my gut was now a full-blown sense of dread. The delivery driver took a step back, but didn't move to leave. He continued to stand there, the porch light casting an eerie glow on his face. My heart began to race, and I knew I had to do something to end this unnerving situation. I mustered the courage to close the door, my heart pounding as I locked it behind me. I watched through the peephole as the man finally turned away and headed back to his car, a sense of relief washing over me. As he drove away into the rainy night, I couldn't help but wonder about the chilling encounter. What had been his true intentions? Why had he lingered, casting a shadow of unease over a simple pizza delivery? The rainy evening, once a source of comfort, now felt tainted by the lingering fear. I reported the incident to the pizza place, but the mystery of the unsettling delivery driver remained unsolved. The rain outside continued to fall, as though washing away any trace of the encounter, but the memory would forever haunt my thoughts. The simple act of ordering a pizza had led me into the heart of a real-life nightmare, a reminder that terror can strike even in the most mundane of circumstances. That evening would forever remain etched in my memory, a chilling encounter that defied explanation. A few years back, my girlfriend and I decided to embark on a camping trip, seeking solace in the arms of nature. It was meant to be a romantic escape, a chance to connect with the wilderness and each other. Little did we know that our idyllic getaway would transform into a nightmarish ordeal. The day had been pleasant, with the sun casting a warm glow over our campsite. We hiked, roasted marshmallows, and reveled in the simplicity of our surroundings. But as the evening approached, dark clouds gathered, foretelling a change in the weather. The first drops of rain began to fall, gentle at first, but soon transforming into a relentless downpour. We sought refuge in our tent, hoping to wait out the storm, but as the hours passed, it became clear that the rain wouldn't relent. Our tent began to leak, and we were soon soaked to the bone. With the prospect of a sleepless night in a soggy tent, we made the difficult decision to trek back to our car, which was parked by the road. The darkness outside was absolute, and the rain showed no sign of stopping. We armed ourselves with flashlights and began the eerie journey back to the vehicle. As we trudged through the mud, our flashlights pierced the night, revealing a damp and eerie landscape. The trees seemed to murmur secrets in the darkness, their leaves rustling in the wind. We were drenched, chilled to the bone, and exhaustion clung to us like a shroud. The car was our beacon of hope, promising warmth and dry shelter. But as we reached it, our relief turned to horror. A man stood there, by our car, his presence as unexpected as it was unsettling. He held a flashlight, its beam probing the interior of our vehicle. My girlfriend and I exchanged nervous glances, our unease growing with each passing second. We asked the man what he was doing, but his response was cryptic and void of explanation. He muttered something about needing to check the car. The rain continued to fall, a cacophony that echoed the disquiet in our hearts. The man's behavior was increasingly erratic, and a sense of impending danger began to envelop us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. With a heavy heart, I reached for my phone, ready to dial 911 in case the situation took a darker turn. The man sensed my unease, and his gaze hardened, locking onto me with a predatory intensity. He began to approach us, slowly, but with an unsettling determination. My girlfriend and I retreated, our hearts pounding, as we realized that this man was not to be trusted. We implored him to step back, to leave us alone. But he continued to advance, and the air grew thick with the anticipation of a confrontation. It was then that my girlfriend screamed, her voice piercing the rainy night. I knew we had to act, to protect ourselves from the impending threat. With one final plea, we threatened to call the authorities, our voices shaking. The man hesitated for a moment, his gaze vacillating between us and the car. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. We watched in stunned silence as he faded from view, his motives and intentions remaining a chilling mystery. The rain showed no sign of abating, but we were safe for now. We remained huddled in the car, the nightmarish encounter casting a pall over our camping trip. The rain outside continued to fall, a relentless reminder of the terror we had narrowly escaped. As we waited for the storm to pass, we couldn't help but wonder about the man who had invaded our night. What had driven him to confront us, in the dead of night, by our car? The rain-soaked evening had transformed our romantic getaway into a chilling ordeal, a reminder that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. The memory of that encounter would forever haunt our thoughts, a testament to the dark mysteries of the night. I worked as a delivery driver for a local burger joint. It was a job that paid the bills, but it had its fair share of late-night deliveries and odd encounters. One rainy evening, as I navigated the dimly lit streets, I received an order from a new customer, someone who had never ordered from the restaurant before. The order was simple enough, just 2 burger meals and 2 thick shakes. I hastily prepared the food and rushed it to my car, eager to complete the delivery and get out of the rain. The address was unfamiliar, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, and I wondered what had prompted this new customer to order from us. As I drove through the rain-soaked streets, my windshield wipers working overtime, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The weather mirrored my mood, the darkness and the rain combining to create an atmosphere of foreboding. I knew I had to complete the delivery quickly and return to the comfort of the restaurant. The GPS led me to the address, a small house nestled amidst a row of similar homes. It was a modest neighborhood, and the houses appeared to be uninhabited, their windows shrouded in darkness. I parked in front of the address and grabbed the food, eager to get out of the rain. As I approached the house, the unease I had felt earlier intensified. There was something eerie about the atmosphere, an unshakable sense that something was amiss. The rain continued to fall, a constant backdrop to the mounting tension. I knocked on the door, the sound ringing through the silence of the night. It felt like an eternity before the door slowly creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. A figure stood in the doorway, obscured by shadows. I exchanged a polite greeting, explaining that I had the food they had ordered. The figure remained still, and I couldn't make out any features. My unease grew, but I chalked it up to the darkness and the rain. I handed over the food, the figure finally taking the bags from my grasp. I couldn't help but notice how they seemed to linger in the doorway, as though reluctant to let me leave. I mumbled a thank you, eager to retreat to the safety of my car. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice, soft and menacing, whispering in the darkness. It sent a shiver down my spine, and I turned back to see the figure still standing there, their face now partially visible in the dim light. Their expression was one of malice, and their words were chilling. They spoke of things that made no sense, their voice a sinister undercurrent to the rain. My heart raced, and I knew I had to escape this unsettling encounter. I rushed back to my car, the figure's words echoing in my mind. My hands trembled as I fumbled to start the engine. The rain continued to fall, and the eerie encounter had left me shaken to my core. As I sped away from the house, I couldn't help but wonder about the chilling stranger. What had been their motive? What did their words mean? The rain outside was unrelenting, a constant reminder of the surreal encounter. I reported the incident to the authorities, but the investigation would prove inconclusive. The memory of that night would forever haunt my thoughts, a reminder that danger can lurk in the most mundane of situations. The rain-soaked evening had transformed a routine delivery into a nightmare, and the unsettling encounter had left me with more questions than answers. The memory of that chilling figure would forever remain etched in my memory, a testament to the darkness that can hide behind the simplest of doors. A while back, on a rainy night, my friends and I decided to have a girly night in. The sound of raindrops tapping on the windows served as the perfect backdrop for our evening of pampering. We gathered in my cozy living room, armed with nail polish, hair curlers, and endless stories. As the evening progressed, our laughter and chatter filled the room, a testament to the bond we shared. We painted our nails vibrant shades of red and curled our hair into elegant waves, reveling in the simple joys of our friendship. The rain outside continued to fall, its rhythm like a soothing lullaby. Just when we thought the night couldn't get any better, one of my friends, Lisa, suggested inviting a few boys over to join in the fun. She had met them recently and thought it would be a fun addition to our gathering. Reluctantly, we agreed, thinking it might add an exciting twist to our evening. The boys arrived, and at first, everything seemed perfectly fine. We continued with our pampering session, and the atmosphere was light and enjoyable. But as the evening progressed, one of the boys, named Samuel, began to behave strangely. At first, we brushed it off as mere quirkiness. He seemed fidgety and kept glancing around the room, as though searching for something. His speech became disjointed, and he occasionally mumbled to himself. Lisa, who had invited Samuel, looked worried and confused by his odd behavior. She explained that she barely knew him and had never seen him act like this before. His presence cast a shadow over a once joyful evening. The unease in the room continued to mount as Samuel's behavior escalated. He began to talk to himself in hushed whispers, his eyes darting around the room. It was clear that something was terribly wrong, and my friends and I exchanged anxious glances. As the minutes ticked by, Samuel's demeanor became increasingly menacing. He suddenly stood up and began pacing the room, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. His mumbled words took on an aggressive tone, and it was clear that his presence was no longer welcome. Fear gripped the room as we realized that Samuel's behavior was unpredictable and volatile. We huddled together, unsure of what to do next. The rain outside continued to fall, its gentle pattering a stark contrast to the mounting tension inside. Samuel's pacing grew more frenzied, and he began to shout incoherent threats. The atmosphere in the room had transformed from a night of curly fun to a nightmare. It was clear that we were in danger. We decided to call the authorities, desperate to remove Samuel from our midst. Lisa was visibly shaken, regretting her decision to invite him. As we spoke to the emergency dispatcher, Samuel's shouts grew louder and more menacing. The arrival of the police was a relief, and they swiftly apprehended Samuel. We could hear his frenzied protests as they led him away, his erratic behavior a chilling reminder of the danger he had posed. The rain outside showed no sign of stopping, and our curly night had taken a dark and terrifying turn. The memory of Samuel's menacing presence would forever haunt us, a reminder that danger can lurk even in the most familiar of settings. We learned the importance of trust and safety that night, and the bond between my friends and me was strengthened by the harrowing encounter. A while ago, I found myself alone at home on a rainy night. The sound of rain tapping on my windows was usually comforting, but that night, it felt different. The house was too quiet, and the rain seemed to magnify every little noise. As I settled on the couch, watching a movie and trying to shake off my unease, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was in the house with me. My heart began to race, and I strained my ears to listen more closely. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, echoing through the hallway. Panic set in, and I realized that I had to take action. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, all the while trying to stifle my racing breath. I remained on the line with the dispatcher, my fear mounting with every passing second. The footsteps were getting closer, and my mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. I knew I had to hide, to find some way to protect myself until the authorities arrived. I tiptoed into the kitchen and grabbed a knife, my hands trembling as I clutched the blade. My heart pounded in my chest, and my senses were on high alert. The dispatcher urged me to stay on the line, her voice a lifeline in the midst of my terror. The intruder's movements grew louder, and I realized that they were coming down the hallway toward the kitchen. I hid behind a counter, my breath ragged, and my grip on the knife tightening. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and my heart felt as though it would burst from my chest. The intruder entered, their presence casting a long, chilling shadow. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were there, just a few feet away from me. I held my breath, praying that they wouldn't discover my hiding place. The dispatcher continued to speak softly through the phone, offering words of reassurance. The rain outside seemed to intensify, adding to the eerie atmosphere of the night. The intruder moved around the kitchen, opening drawers and cabinets. The sound of their rummaging sent shivers down my spine. I knew that I had to stay hidden, to wait for the authorities to arrive. But the minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. Just as I thought I couldn't bear the tension any longer, the sound of sirens pierced the night. The intruder froze, their head turning in the direction of the approaching police cars. The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, her words a balm to my frayed nerves. The intruder rushed out of the kitchen and made a hasty escape, disappearing into the rainy night. I remained hidden, my eyes glued to the door, my knife still clutched tightly in my hand. The police arrived and cleared the house, ensuring that the intruder was gone. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, and I felt a sense of safety I had never appreciated before. The rain outside continued to fall, but it was no longer a source of unease. It was a reminder of the night that had changed everything, a night when my home had become a place of terror. I couldn't help but wonder about the intruder and what their intentions had been. The fear of that night would forever linger in the corners of my mind, a reminder that danger can strike even in the supposed safety of one's own home. The rain outside had played a role in the nightmare that had unfolded, and its sound would forever be associated with that chilling encounter. But as I looked out at the rainy night, I knew that I had survived, and that the storm outside could never match the terror I had faced within those walls. Not too long ago, my husband and I decided to have a romantic date night. We watched a captivating movie at the local theater, and as we left, the rain started to pour down. At first, we thought about walking home, as the distance wasn't too far, but the heavy rain changed our minds. Instead, we decided to wait for our Uber under the shelter of the theater's entrance. We huddled together, trying to keep dry while we checked the Uber app for the driver's arrival time. The rain cascaded down in sheets, the rhythmic sound creating a calming ambience despite our growing impatience. As we waited, we chatted about the movie we'd just seen, finding solace in the conversation. The date had been going so well, and the rain was just a minor inconvenience. However, that tranquility was shattered when two men approached us under the shelter. They looked to be in their early 30s, dressed in worn-out jackets and socky sneakers. Their appearance was disheveled, and the way they moved seemed strange, almost as if they were staggering. One of the men, his eyes glassy and vacant, started mumbling something that I couldn't quite understand. My husband and I exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. The rain outside continued to fall relentlessly, adding to the eerie atmosphere of the encounter. I tried to politely ignore the man's ramblings, hoping he would move along, but his words grew louder and more erratic. He seemed to be growing increasingly agitated, and it was clear that he was not in his right mind. My husband, always the protector, stepped forward and asked the man if there was anything he needed. The other man, who had been silent until then, suddenly spoke up, his voice a low growl. He muttered something about needing money and stared at us with a menacing glint in his eye. Fear gripped my heart, and I instinctively reached for my phone, ready to call the police if things took a turn for the worse. The rain outside continued to pour, as though it were trying to drown out the tension that had settled over us. The agitated man grew more insistent, demanding money from us. My husband, trying to defuse the situation, told the man we didn't have any cash. The other man, however, was not satisfied with our response and began to advance towards us, his movements becoming more aggressive. I felt a surge of panic, the realization hitting me that we were in a dangerous situation. My husband stepped in front of me, trying to protect me from the advancing man. We were trapped under the shelter, and there was nowhere to run. Just as the situation seemed to be spiraling out of control, the sound of our Uber pulling up to the curb was a welcome relief. The driver stepped out and called us over, unaware of the tension that had been building under the shelter. We hurried into the car, leaving the two menacing men behind. The rain-soaked streets disappeared in the rearview mirror as our Uber driver pulled away from the scene. As we drove away, my heart still pounding with fear, I couldn't help but wonder about the chilling encounter we had just experienced. The rain outside had played a role in turning a romantic date night into a nightmare, and its sound would forever be associated with that eerie encounter. The tension of that night lingered, a stark reminder that danger can lurk even in the most mundane of situations. We had survived, but the memory of the encounter would forever haunt our thoughts, a testament to the unpredictable nature of the world around us. Working the night shift as a security guard was never my idea of a dream job, but it paid the bills, and that was what mattered. On one particular rainy night, the sound of raindrops against the warehouse's windows created an eerie backdrop to my otherwise mundane routine. As I prepared to start my patrol, I grabbed my flashlight and raincoat. The warehouse was enormous, and it was my responsibility to ensure its safety throughout the night. The rain outside showed no signs of letting up, and the monotony of the job weighed on me. I stepped out into the rain, the cold water quickly soaking through my uniform. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the eerie emptiness of the warehouse's surroundings. The wet ground squelched beneath my boots with each step. I made my way around the perimeter, my senses on high alert despite the monotony of the job. But then, as I rounded a corner, I saw them, two men standing near the warehouse's fence. Their figures were partially obscured by the rain, but they were unmistakably there. Approaching them was protocol in these situations. I had to ask them to leave the premises. After all, it was private property. With flashlight in hand, I approached the strangers. The rain soaked through my uniform, chilling me to the bone as I neared the two men. They were silent, their faces hidden in the shadows. I cleared my throat and spoke in a firm, authoritative tone, asking them to leave the area. One of the men slowly turned to face me, and in the dim light, I could see a sly, menacing grin on his face. He began to laugh, a low, haunting chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. The other man's posture became tense, as though he was ready to react to any signal from his companion. My instincts told me that something was terribly wrong. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I asked them again to leave, my voice tinged with fear this time. The laughter from the first man grew louder, more maniacal. It echoed through the empty warehouse lot, adding to the eerie atmosphere of the night. I could see the rain soaking through his clothes, but he seemed unfazed by the cold, wet night. Suddenly, the second man stepped forward, his movements quick and unpredictable. He was now just a few feet away from me, his eyes glinting with malice. My heart raced, and I realized that I was in a perilous situation. The rain continued to fall, intensifying the tension of the encounter. I knew that I had to take action, and I quickly turned and ran back toward the safety of the warehouse, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the entrance, I radioed for assistance, desperately relaying what had just transpired. The rain-soaked night had turned from mundane to terrifying in the blink of an eye, and I knew I needed help. Moments later, the sound of sirens pierced the rainy night, and the two menacing men disappeared into the darkness. The arrival of the authorities brought relief, and they searched the area, but the strangers were gone. I couldn't help but wonder about the chilling encounter I had experienced that night. The rain had added an eerie backdrop to the encounter, and its sound would forever be associated with the fear that had gripped me. Working the night shift as a security guard was never my idea of a dream job, but it paid the bills, and that was what mattered. On one particular rainy night, the sound of raindrops against the warehouse's windows created an eerie backdrop to my otherwise mundane routine. As I prepared to start my patrol, I grabbed my flashlight and raincoat. The warehouse was enormous, and it was my responsibility to ensure its safety throughout the night. The rain outside showed no signs of letting up, and the monotony of the job weighed on me. I stepped out into the rain, the cold water quickly soaking through my uniform. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the eerie emptiness of the warehouse's surroundings. The wet ground squelched beneath my boots with each step. I made my way around the perimeter, my senses on high alert despite the monotony of the job. But then, as I rounded a corner, I saw them, two men standing near the warehouse's fence. Their figures were partially obscured by the rain, but they were unmistakably there. Approaching them was protocol in these situations. I had to ask them to leave the premises. After all, it was private property. With flashlight in hand, I approached the strangers. The rain soaked through my uniform, chilling me to the bone as I neared the two men. They were silent, their faces hidden in the shadows. I cleared my throat and spoke in a firm, authoritative tone, asking them to leave the area. One of the men slowly turned to face me, and in the dim light, I could see a sly, menacing grin on his face. He began to laugh, a low, haunting chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. The other man's posture became tense, as though he was ready to react to any signal from his companion. My instincts told me that something was terribly wrong. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I asked them again to leave, my voice tinged with fear this time. The laughter from the first man grew louder, more maniacal. It echoed through the empty warehouse lot, adding to the eerie atmosphere of the night. I could see the rain soaking through his clothes, but he seemed unfazed by the cold, wet night. Suddenly, the second man stepped forward, his movements quick and unpredictable. He was now just a few feet away from me, his eyes glinting with malice. My heart raced, and I realized that I was in a perilous situation. The rain continued to fall, intensifying the tension of the encounter. I knew that I had to take action, and I quickly turned and ran back toward the safety of the warehouse, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the entrance, I radioed for assistance, desperately relaying what had just transpired. The rain-soaked night had turned from mundane to terrifying in the blink of an eye, and I knew I needed help. Moments later, the sound of sirens pierced the rainy night, and the two menacing men disappeared into the darkness. The arrival of the authorities brought relief, and they searched the area, but the strangers were gone. I couldn't help but wonder about the chilling encounter I had experienced that night. The rain had added an eerie backdrop to the encounter, and its sound would forever be associated with the fear that had gripped me. Living in a cramped apartment in the city, taking my dog out for his nightly business had become a monotonous routine. It was one of those evenings when the rain was coming down in torrents, and the thought of venturing into the downpour was far from appealing. But my loyal dog, Buster, had to go out, so I begrudgingly donned my raincoat and grabbed his leash. As we descended the apartment stairs and entered the bustling streets, the incessant rain created a cold, oppressive atmosphere. The city seemed different at night in the rain, and I hurried Buster along, eager to get back inside where it was dry. We rounded the block, and I could feel Buster's discomfort with the rain as he tugged on his leash, eager to return home. As we turned a corner, I noticed a group of men up ahead. They stood beneath a flickering street lamp, their figures cast in an eerie, wavering light. They were a peculiar sight, to say the least. Their clothes were tattered, and they huddled close together as if to shield themselves from the rain. But what unsettled me most was the way they stared at us, their eyes filled with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. Buster, usually a friendly and outgoing dog, had begun to growl softly, his hackles raised. I could feel his unease, and it mirrored my own. We continued walking, but the group of men remained where they were, their eyes never leaving us. As we drew closer, I could hear them muttering to one another, their words incomprehensible. The rain pelted down, and the city seemed to grow eerily silent. My grip on Buster's leash tightened, and I quickened my pace. One of the men stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a gaunt figure, his face partially hidden beneath a ragged hood. His eyes, however, were unmistakable, cold and emotionless. He began to speak, his voice barely a whisper, but laced with an unsettling intensity. The words he uttered were in a language I couldn't recognize, and they sent shivers down my spine. Buster, sensing my unease, barked loudly, his protective instincts in full force. The group of men seemed unfazed by Buster's reaction, and they continued to mutter and stare. I knew we had to get out of there, and I tugged Buster's leash, trying to hurry past them. But the strange man who had stepped forward reached out and grabbed my arm, his grip like ice. He continued to speak, his voice growing louder and more insistent. The rain seemed to intensify, and it felt as if time had slowed to a crawl. Panic surged through me, and I tried to free myself from his grasp, but he held on, his grip unyielding. Buster, sensing my distress, lunged at the man, teeth bared. The other men stepped back, and the man released his hold, staggering back in surprise. We had a moment of respite, and I pulled Buster away, my heart pounding. I hurried back to our apartment, not daring to look back. The rain continued to pour, and the memory of that chilling encounter haunted my thoughts. The city's rain-slicked streets had turned from mundane to terrifying in the blink of an eye. Rainy nights have always given me an eerie feeling. It was one such night when I had an encounter that still haunts me. The relentless downpour was like a constant drumming on the roof, creating an atmosphere of solitude that I usually found comforting. But this night, it was different. I had just finished a long day at work and was heading home, my windshield wipers swaying back and forth, battling the heavy rain. The streets were nearly empty, and the faint glow of the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows. My car's tires splashed through puddles as I navigated the slick roads. As I approached a desolate stretch of road, I noticed a figure up ahead. A solitary man, drenched by the rain, was standing by the side of the road, his thumb outstretched. It was a scene I'd encountered before, a hitchhiker seeking refuge from the rain. However, something about this man made my heart race. His clothes were disheveled, and his face was obscured by the hood of his tattered jacket. I couldn't see his features, but I could feel his eyes on me as I approached. A sudden chill coursed through my body as I slowed down and came to a stop. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window. The man leaned closer, his hood still obscuring his face. "Could you give me a lift?" he asked, his voice shaky, as if he were drenched not only in rain but in fear. I hesitated, my instincts warning me that something was off. "Where are you headed?" I finally asked. He hesitated too, and then replied, "Just a few miles down the road. Anywhere you can drop me would be fine." I decided to trust my gut and reluctantly unlocked the car doors. He climbed into the passenger seat, his wet clothes soaking the upholstery, and the car was immediately filled with a musty, damp odor. As we continued down the rain-soaked road, the atmosphere in the car grew increasingly tense. The only sound was the relentless pitter-patter of rain on the roof. I attempted small talk, asking the man about his day, but he responded with vague and evasive answers. A sense of unease crept over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I contemplated what to do. I noticed his hands. They were trembling uncontrollably, and my suspicion deepened. As we approached the supposed drop-off point, I decided it was time to end this unsettling journey. I pulled over to the side of the road and turned to the man. "This is as far as I can take you," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond, but continued to stare ahead, his hood still obscuring his face. I felt a chill run down my spine as I reached for the door handle, ready to ask him to leave. That's when he finally turned his head slowly in my direction. His face, illuminated by the dim car interior light, was like nothing I'd ever seen. His eyes were hollow and devoid of emotion, his skin ashen and translucent. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. My heart pounded in my chest, and my instinct screamed at me to get out of there. With a surge of adrenaline, I flung open the car door and bolted out into the pouring rain. I didn't look back, but I could hear the man's unsettling laughter echoing through the night. I ran to the nearest house, pounded on the door, and begged the startled homeowner to call the police. It was only then, in the safety of a stranger's home, that I began to comprehend the gravity of what had just happened. The police arrived promptly, and they conducted a search of the area, but the man had vanished into the rainy night. They assured me that they would do everything they could to locate him, but they could offer no explanation for the encounter or the man's disturbing appearance. It was a typical rainy evening during our teenage years, a time when rebellion was our closest companion. Seeking refuge from the downpour, my friends and I huddled beneath a small park shelter, our secret stash of liquor our only solace. The raindrops tapped a melancholic rhythm on the shelter's tin roof, and our laughter echoed through the otherwise deserted park. We were invincible in those moments, or so we believed, until a sudden, chilling encounter shattered our carefree world. As we shared stories, passing around a bottle of stolen whiskey, the laughter gradually faded. The rain outside painted a gloomy backdrop, and the streetlight's feeble glow cast long, eerie shadows that danced around us. The park that usually felt like our own kingdom began to take on a sinister aura. That's when we first noticed him. He emerged from the curtain of rain, a figure so peculiar that he seemed otherworldly. Dressed in tattered rags, his hair hung in greasy tendrils over his face, and he moved with a deliberate and unsettling slowness. His eyes were hidden beneath the brim of a hat that had seen better days. "Evening, lads," he muttered as he drew nearer. His voice was a guttural growl, sending chills down our spines. We exchanged wary glances, but our youthful bravado still held. "What do you want, old man?" one of my friends jeered, trying to sound tough. Ignoring the question, the stranger continued to approach us. His steady, deliberate steps brought him closer to the shelter. The dim light from our single lantern flickered, casting eerie shadows on his haggard face. A feeling of unease washed over us as he finally stood before us, his eyes hidden in the shadows of his hat. He raised a trembling hand, revealing a tattered piece of paper. The writing on it was smudged and barely legible, as if it had been exposed to the elements for far too long. "Young ones," he rasped, "I have a message for you." His voice was a whisper, but it carried an uncanny intensity. We exchanged puzzled glances, our earlier bravado replaced by an unsettling curiosity. "What kind of message?" I ventured to ask, my voice trembling. The stranger's lips curved into a disconcerting smile, revealing yellowed, crooked teeth. "A warning," he replied. "A warning about the rain." As he spoke, the rain outside seemed to intensify, its rhythmic patter growing louder and more ominous. It was as if the elements themselves were conspiring with the stranger to create an atmosphere of dread. My friends and I exchanged glances once more, uncertainty and fear etched on our faces. The stranger continued, his words more cryptic with each passing moment. He spoke of an ancient curse, a curse tied to the rain, a curse that had haunted his family for generations. It was a tale of tragedy and suffering, of lost souls doomed to roam the earth on rainy nights, seeking solace and meaning. The stranger's voice grew more impassioned, and the air inside the shelter seemed to thicken with an otherworldly presence. As he spoke, I couldn't help but glance out at the rain-soaked park. It was as if the very raindrops had taken on a malevolent life of their own, each one carrying a weight of despair and sorrow. My friends and I were entranced by the stranger's story, unable to tear our eyes away from his haunting presence. The atmosphere had become surreal, the shelter no longer a place of refuge but a stage for a macabre performance. The stranger concluded his tale, his eyes finally emerging from the shadows of his hat. They were empty, devoid of emotion, and they locked onto each of us with a penetrating gaze. It was as if he had cast a spell, and we were ensnared in his web of eerie storytelling. The rain continued to pour, and our unease grew with each passing moment. I felt a chill in the air, a sense of impending doom that I couldn't shake. We were trapped in a nightmare of our own making, brought on by a reckless desire for adventure and rebellion. As the stranger's unsettling laughter echoed through the shelter, I couldn't help but wonder if the curse of the rain had claimed us, its hapless victims. The once invulnerable teenagers had become puppets in a chilling encounter that would forever haunt us. As the rain relentlessly pounded the city outside, I found myself immersed in a wave of nostalgia, reminiscing about a chilling encounter from my past, a night when a seemingly normal trip to Blockbuster Video turned into a nightmare. The memories had faded over the years, but that night remained etched in my mind. It was a rainy night, much like the one outside my window now. I was in my late teens, seeking refuge from the downpour, and the local Blockbuster store seemed like the perfect hideaway. The familiar scent of popcorn and the hum of fluorescent lights welcomed me as I stepped inside, the rain-soaked wind still fresh on my skin. I strolled through the narrow aisles, my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. The flickering light from the ceiling cast eerie shadows on the rows of DVD cases. It was a trip down memory lane, and I was lost in a world of cinematic possibilities. That's when I saw him, an enigmatic figure standing by the horror section. His silhouette was barely discernible in the dim light, but something about his presence sent shivers down my spine. He seemed out of place, as if he didn't belong in the aisles of Blockbuster. I tried to dismiss my unease, assuming he was just another customer, but the way he stared at the horror movie covers with an intensity that bordered on obsession was unsettling. I moved on to the new releases section, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The rain outside had intensified, and the distant sound of thunder echoed through the store, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As I browsed the DVDs, I couldn't help but glance back at the strange man. He was still there, his eyes locked onto the horror section. It was as if he was in a trance, his mind lost in the world of gory films and macabre tales. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to approach him, partially to break the awkward silence that had fallen over the store. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. "Hey," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Looks like you're a fan of horror, huh?" The man turned to me, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. His eyes met mine, and they were piercing, a deep shade of gray that seemed to see right through me. "Yes," he replied, his voice a soft whisper. "Horror is my life." I forced a smile, though his response sent a chill down my spine. There was something off about him, something that didn't quite fit the setting. We struck up a conversation, and he seemed knowledgeable about horror movies, discussing obscure titles and directors I had never heard of. But the more he spoke, the more my unease grew. There was a sinister edge to his words, a darkness that couldn't be ignored. He spoke of gruesome scenes and gore with a disturbing enthusiasm, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling light. It was as if he reveled in the darkest aspects of the genre, finding a twisted joy in the macabre. As the conversation continued, I couldn't help but feel trapped. The man's intensity had a suffocating effect, and I found it increasingly difficult to break away. It was as if his words held me captive, and the distant rumble of thunder seemed to underscore the growing tension. Eventually, I managed to extricate myself from the conversation, offering a feeble excuse about needing to pick out a movie and make my way to the counter. The store had grown eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional drip of rainwater from the ceiling. But as I made my way to the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, the man from the horror section. He trailed behind me, his eyes never leaving my back. Panic surged through me, and I quickened my pace, my heart racing as I approached the store's entrance. The rain outside had intensified, and the downpour masked the sound of my hurried footsteps. I burst through the door and into the deluge, my clothes instantly soaked by the relentless rain. But I didn't care. I needed to escape from the man who had haunted the aisles of Blockbuster. As I rushed down the sidewalk, I couldn't help but glance back at the store. The man stood in the doorway, his hood now removed, revealing a face etched with madness. His eyes locked onto mine, and the sinister smile on his lips sent a shiver down my spine. I ran through the rain-soaked streets, my heart pounding, the chilling encounter at Blockbuster forever etched in my memory. The rain that had once been a source of comfort had become a torrential downpour, as if the elements themselves conspired to mirror the terror I had felt inside the store. It was a stormy night, and my new girlfriend and I had chosen a cozy Airbnb for a quiet, romantic getaway. The rain pelted against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop to our evening. We had just finished a candlelit dinner when an unexpected visitor arrived, shattering the tranquility of our evening. We heard a knock at the door, and I exchanged a puzzled glance with my girlfriend. It was late, and we weren't expecting anyone. As I opened the door, a gust of wind and rain rushed in, causing the candles to flicker and dim. A man stood on the doorstep, drenched from head to toe. He appeared disheveled, with a wild look in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. He mumbled something about needing shelter and claimed his car had broken down nearby. As I considered whether to offer help or call for assistance, the man's gaze locked onto my girlfriend, and he seemed to grow more agitated. He stepped closer, invading our personal space, his presence becoming increasingly unsettling. My girlfriend, sensing the tension, attempted to close the door, but the man placed a foot in the doorway, preventing her from doing so. Panic welled up within us, and I could feel my heart racing. It was clear that this encounter had taken a dark turn. The man's behavior grew more erratic by the moment. He rambled about strange things, his words barely coherent. He muttered something about being followed and the need to hide. His eyes darted around the room, and I realized that we were not dealing with a mere stranger in distress. Fear gnawed at us as we tried to de-escalate the situation. We offered to call for help or provide him with a number for a nearby tow truck, but he refused, growing increasingly agitated. The storm outside had intensified, and the sound of rain pounding on the roof underscored the ominous atmosphere in the room. Suddenly, the man lunged forward, attempting to push his way into the Airbnb. It was a terrifying moment, and I instinctively stepped between him and my girlfriend. She shrieked, and I could see the fear in her eyes. Desperation and adrenaline surged through me, and I summoned all my strength to push the man back out the door. He stumbled, but his obsession with gaining entry into the Airbnb remained unwavering. As I tried to reason with him, my girlfriend called the police, whispering our address into the phone. The man's threats and incoherent rambling had become increasingly sinister, and it was clear that we were dealing with someone unhinged. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for the police to arrive. The storm outside seemed to rage in tandem with our escalating fear. The man continued to press against the door, his eyes locked onto my girlfriend, his intent chillingly clear. When the police finally arrived, they subdued the man and took him into custody. It was a sigh of relief, but the trauma of that night remained with us. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm that seemed surreal in contrast to the chilling encounter we had just survived. In the days that followed, we learned that the man had a history of mental health issues. He had escaped from a nearby facility and had been wandering the streets in a state of delusion. Our Airbnb had unwittingly become the refuge for his disturbed thoughts, shrouding our evening in a cloud of terror. It was one of those stormy nights when the world outside was shrouded in darkness, and the relentless rain hammered against the windows. I had settled into my cozy home, a sanctuary from the tempestuous weather outside. My husband was away on a business trip, leaving me alone in the house. As I curled up on the couch, the comforting sound of rain on the roof was soon interrupted by an eerie noise that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a faint scratching sound, like nails on a chalkboard, coming from the backyard. My heart raced as my mind conjured unsettling possibilities. With cautious steps, I approached the back door. The rain cascaded down, obscuring my view of the yard. The dim glow of the porch light revealed nothing but the shadowy outlines of trees and shrubs swaying in the wind. The scratching persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I had always been cautious and had learned to trust my instincts, so I reached for the umbrella by the door and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, and I stepped out into the tempest. The torrential rain soaked through my clothes, instantly chilling me to the bone. My footsteps were muffled by the rain-soaked grass as I ventured further into the yard. The scratching led me to the garden shed at the far end of the yard, its old wooden door bearing the brunt of the relentless weather. As I approached the shed, the scratching noise ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. My heart pounded in my chest, and the feeling of dread intensified. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to retreat and call the authorities. But the thought of someone trespassing on my property fueled my determination. With trembling hands, I gripped the shed's doorknob and pushed it open. The creaking hinges sounded like a deafening scream in the stillness of the night. My flashlight pierced the darkness, revealing the cluttered interior of the shed. Amid the gardening tools and old boxes, I spotted a silhouette huddled in the corner. A shiver ran down my spine as my flashlight's beam illuminated the intruder's face. His eyes were wild, filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. The man's disheveled appearance and soaked clothing bore witness to the relentless storm. My initial shock gave way to compassion, as it was clear that this was not the face of a malevolent intruder. He appeared to be a homeless man seeking shelter from the storm. Still, the situation was undeniably chilling, and I felt vulnerable and uncertain. I slowly backed out of the shed, my heart still racing, and tried to reassure the man. He muttered something about needing a place to stay, and I directed him toward the garage, where he could find some temporary shelter from the rain. The situation was tense, but I remained cautious, aware that appearances could be deceiving. I retreated back into the house, my fingers trembling as I locked the door and called the police. I explained the situation, and they assured me that an officer would arrive shortly to assess the situation. As I waited for the authorities to arrive, my mind raced with a mixture of fear and empathy. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within me. When the police officer arrived, he discovered the man in the garage and escorted him away, ensuring he received the help he needed. The storm eventually subsided, but the memory of that chilling encounter remained etched in my mind. It was a stormy night, the kind where the rain pelts the windows with relentless force and the wind howls through the trees like a banshee. I had always enjoyed the cozy atmosphere of a rainy night, with a good book and a cup of tea. But this particular night, the storm brought with it something chilling, something I would never forget. I had recently moved into a new house, a charming old cottage nestled deep in the woods. It was an escape from the hustle and bustle of city life, and I relished the solitude it offered. However, the storm had intensified, and the darkness outside was nearly impenetrable. As I sat in my living room, the flickering candlelight cast eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. The rain drummed on the roof like a chaotic symphony, and the occasional distant thunder rumbled through the night. My dog, Buddy, was curled up beside me, his presence offering a reassuring comfort. But as the storm raged on, the atmosphere inside began to change. Buddy, who was usually calm and composed, suddenly became agitated. He crawled softly, the hair on his back standing on end. His attention was fixed on the front door. I tried to dismiss it as a reaction to the storm, but something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. A chill ran down my spine as I considered the possibility that someone might be outside, seeking refuge from the tempest. The thought was unsettling, and I approached the door cautiously, hoping it was just my imagination. But as I peered through the rain-smeared glass, my heart skipped a beat. There, on the doorstep, stood a stranger. He was drenched from head to toe, his clothing clinging to his shivering form. His hair was matted and unkempt, and his eyes, as he met my gaze, held an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. The man's face bore a look of desperation and urgency. Despite my unease, I couldn't ignore the humanitarian impulse that welled within me. I opened the door and invited him in. His voice was hoarse, and he explained that he had been hiking in the woods and lost his way, taking refuge on my porch when the storm hit. Buddy remained wary, growling softly, but I offered the stranger a warm blanket and a hot cup of tea. The man's story seemed plausible, and he appeared to be genuinely grateful for the shelter. We talked for a while, and as the storm continued to rage outside, I couldn't shake the sense that something was amiss. His answers to my questions were vague, and there was a nervous energy about him that I couldn't ignore. My unease deepened when he began to ask more personal questions about my life, my routines, and my living situation. Alarm bells rang in my mind, and I realized that I had made a grave mistake by inviting a stranger into my home in the middle of a stormy night. I discreetly reached for my phone, prepared to dial 911, but the man's demeanor shifted. He grew agitated and demanded that I hand over my phone. Buddy, sensing the tension, bared his teeth and growled menacingly. The man's desperation turned to menace, and he advanced towards me, his intent clear. Panic surged through me, and I knew I had to act fast. With trembling hands, I unleashed Buddy, who sprang into action with a ferocity I had never seen before. A fierce struggle ensued, and in the chaos, I managed to call 911. The authorities arrived swiftly, and the intruder was apprehended. As it turned out, he had a criminal record and a history of violent behavior. The storm eventually subsided, but the memory of that chilling encounter haunted my thoughts. It had been a night filled with suspense and terror, a stark reminder that danger could come knocking even in the most tranquil of settings. Buddy, my loyal companion, had been the hero of the night, and I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if he hadn't been there to protect me. The storm outside had been relentless, but the storm within had forever altered my sense of security in the solitude of my wooded sanctuary. I served as a Coast Guard for over a decade, and I thought I'd seen it all. Storms that would terrify most people had become my regular companions. But one rainy night, out in the turbulent waters, I had an encounter that would forever haunt my dreams. It was a typical stormy evening, and the call had come in about a distressed fishing vessel. The wind howled, the rain was relentless, and the darkness was all-encompassing. My fellow crew members and I headed out in our trusted vessel, scanning the black waves for any sign of the struggling boat. The radio chatter between our ship and the distressed vessel was frantic and desperate. It was a small fishing boat, with 3 souls aboard, and they were in trouble. Their engine had failed, and the storm was pushing them dangerously close to the treacherous rocks near the shoreline. As our vessel drew closer to their position, the rain and wind became so fierce that it was nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. But the distressed vessel's flares and signal lights pierced the darkness, guiding us in. We managed to reach the stricken fishing boat and began our efforts to tow them to safety. The sea was merciless, and the waves were mountainous. It was an all-consuming battle against the elements. Our crew worked tirelessly, drenched to the bone and freezing from the icy rain. Amid the chaos and the roar of the storm, I glimpsed a figure on the distressed fishing boat. At first, I thought it was one of the fishermen, but something was terribly wrong. The figure moved unnaturally, jerkily, as if puppeted by some unseen force. With great difficulty, we secured a line to their vessel, but as we started the slow and perilous journey back to the safety of the harbor, the figure on the fishing boat came into full view under the intense beam of our floodlights. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a woman, her face contorted in a grotesque, silent scream. Her skin was ghastly pale, her eyes vacant and lifeless. She was soaked through, and her drenched hair clung to her like a grotesque mask. We did everything in our power to secure her and administer first aid, but there was something profoundly wrong. It was as if she had been snatched from the abyss of the sea, a victim of the storm's fury. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and it was clear she needed immediate medical attention. We radioed ahead, and an ambulance was waiting for us at the harbor. The woman was rushed to the hospital, but nothing could be done to save her. She was declared dead on arrival. The entire crew was shaken by the experience. What had happened to her out there in the storm? How had she become so horribly twisted and lifeless? The mystery deepened when we contacted the other two fishermen from the boat. They had no idea who she was or where she had come from. They insisted she hadn't been on board when they left the harbor, and the whole situation was an enigma to them as well. As I stood in the rain-soaked harbor, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of unease. The storm had delivered something more than just wind and waves that night. It had brought us a chilling encounter that defied all rational explanation. To this day, the image of that contorted, lifeless woman haunts my nightmares. The sea, as unforgiving as it may be, had never shown us anything like this before. I had been traveling through Asia for several months, moving from one country to another, camping out in the wilderness or staying at hostels. It was an adventure, something I'd always dreamt of, but one rainy night, that adventure took a terrifying turn. The sky had been ominous all day, and by evening, the rain came pouring down relentlessly. I had set up my small campsite near the edge of a dense thicket of trees. The sound of the rain on the leaves was deafening, but I felt safe and dry in my tent. As the night descended, I lay inside my sleeping bag, listening to the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie symphony. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the trees just outside my tent. At first, I tried to dismiss it as the rain and the wind playing tricks on my ears, but the rustling grew louder and more distinct. It was as if someone or something was moving through the soaked leaves and underbrush. My heart began to race. I had seen my share of wildlife on this journey, but this sounded different. The rustling continued, drawing nearer to my tent. I held my breath, straining my ears to catch any clue of what might be out there. Then came the most unsettling part. Above the sound of the rain, I heard a low, guttural growl. It was nothing like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, menacing, and chilling. The growl was followed by the sound of heavy, labored breathing. I knew I couldn't stay huddled in my tent any longer. With trembling hands, I unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the drenched night. The rain soaked me instantly, but my eyes darted to the source of the growling and breathing. In the dim light, I could make out the figure of a man crouching in the wet underbrush. He was shirtless, his skin pale and covered in mud. His hair was matted and tangled, hanging in wet strands around his face. His eyes met mine, and they were wild, like those of a feral animal. The man continued to growl and breathe heavily, never breaking eye contact. Fear surged through me, and I stumbled back, away from the tent and the eerie figure lurking outside. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was no ordinary encounter with a fellow traveler or even a wild animal. This man seemed deranged, possibly dangerous. I knew I had to get out of there, but the rain and the darkness were working against me. I slowly began to retreat from the campsite, my eyes never leaving the menacing man in the thicket. His growls and heavy breathing grew more intense as I moved away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a prey in some dreadful, macabre hunt. My heart pounded in my chest as I trudged through the rain-soaked wilderness, my senses on high alert. With every step, the growls and heavy breathing of the man in the thicket faded, but my fear remained. I had no way of knowing what had brought him to that eerie, wild state, but I knew I had narrowly escaped a chilling encounter in that drenched and sinister night. As I continued my journey through Asia, I couldn't forget the haunting sound of the rain on the leaves and the memory of those wild, feral eyes. The adventure had taken on a new, more sinister edge, and I couldn't help but wonder what other unsettling encounters lay ahead. It was a stormy night, one of those evenings when the howling wind and driving rain made it seem like the world outside was in chaos. I was at home, alone, as my wife was out of town visiting her family. With the constant patter of rain on the windows, I tried to distract myself with a book and a glass of whiskey, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. The house felt unfamiliar and unsettling in the storm's flickering darkness. The creaks of old wood and the howling wind outside echoed eerily through the hallways. The lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. As the hours passed, I grew increasingly restless. It wasn't just a storm, it was a growing sense of being watched, of someone's presence in the house. I dismissed it as my imagination running wild. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to investigate, thinking that maybe a window was left open, causing the odd sounds. I grabbed a flashlight, the comforting weight of it in my hand, and made my way cautiously through the darkened house. I checked all the windows, verifying that they were securely shut. But as I ventured deeper into the house, the unease intensified. It wasn't just the eerie sounds anymore, it was the overwhelming sense that I was now alone. Each room I entered, I felt a pair of eyes on me, unseen but unmistakably present. My search took me to the basement, where the dim glow of the flashlight illuminated a cluttered space filled with old furniture and storage boxes. I had always found the basement unsettling, but that night it was unbearable. The faint scent of dampness hung in the air. As I scanned the room, the flashlight's beam landed on something that sent a chill through my spine. A set of footprints, muddy and recent, led from the basement stairs toward the corner. They were not mine. They were unmistakably fresh. Panic surged through me as I realized that an intruder had made their way into my home. Dread weighed heavily on my chest as I followed the tracks, step by cautious step, until they led me to a small, dimly lit corner of the basement. My flashlight revealed an alcove that I had never paid much attention to, a space hidden by a tattered curtain. I approached the curtain with trepidation, and as I drew it back, my heart plummeted. There, huddled in the corner, was a person. A stranger, drenched from the rain, with matted hair that clung to their face. Their eyes met mine, wide with fear and desperation. They were disheveled, their clothes torn, and it was clear that they had taken shelter in my home. I was overcome with shock and alarm, but I couldn't ignore the terror in their eyes. Before I could react, the stranger began to speak, their voice trembling as they explained that they had been chased through the storm by a group of menacing individuals. They had sought refuge in my home out of desperation, and it was clear that they were terrified for their life. With the storm raging outside and the late hour, I knew I had a difficult decision to make. My instincts told me to call the police, but something about the stranger's fear resonated with me. I couldn't turn them away to face the unknown dangers that lurked outside in the tempest. I offered the person shelter, trying to trust my instincts. They stayed in my home that stormy night, and I stayed awake, my unease replaced by an unsettling mix of compassion and fear. I couldn't shake the chilling encounter or the thought of what might have happened if I had not found them in that hidden corner of my home. The storm eventually passed, and the stranger left with a promise of finding safety, leaving me to ponder the nightmare-worthy encounter in the quiet aftermath of the tempest.